Throughout human history, we have faced a relentless enemy, infectious diseases. These silent assassins have swept across populations, leaving devastation and despair in their wake. From the smallpox's disfiguring scars to the ongoing HIV/AIDS pandemic, humanity has grappled with these invisible threats that have reshaped societies, claimed countless lives, and spurred significant advancements in medicine. So, what were the defining characteristics of these diseases, and how did they transform the societies they afflicted? Ebola. Few diseases have sparked such widespread fear and panic as Ebola, a virus that emerged on the world stage only in the late 1970s from the depths of Africa. This virus, formerly known as Ebola hemorrhagic fever, wreaks havoc on humans and other primates, causing extreme internal and external bleeding. The onset of symptoms can be agonizingly slow, taking anywhere from several days to a few weeks to appear. The initial phase often mimics a nasty flu, with a persistent sore throat, muscle aches that leave you feeling like you've been run over by a truck, and relentless waves of nausea and diarrhea. As the virus tightens its grip, the symptoms escalate into a terrifying nightmare, with uncontrollable bleeding erupting both internally and from various orifices. The severity of Ebola varies depending on the specific strain, but it is a notoriously deadly virus. On average, nearly half of those infected die from the disease, with some strains boasting a horrifyingly high mortality rate approaching 90%. The most devastating Ebola outbreak in history erupted in West Africa in March 2014, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This single outbreak claimed the lives of 5 times more individuals than all previous outbreaks combined. The virus's reach extended far beyond Africa, with cases reported in the United States and several European countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Spain. It wasn't until 2016 that the world finally managed to wrestle the virus back under control, achieving full containment. Bubonic Plague. In the 14th century, a terrifying specter swept across Europe from east to west, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This was the Bubonic Plague, forever etched in history as the Black Death. The culprit behind this horrifying epidemic was a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which hitched a ride on unsuspecting oriental rat fleas. These fleas, traveling westward on the bustling Silk Road and across the Mediterranean on ships, became the silent assassins that unleashed the plague upon human populations. In essence, Europe's burgeoning trade and commerce inadvertently became the harbingers of a deadly pathogen. The disease, named after the Latin word bubo for a swollen lymph node, manifested with chilling symptoms. It began subtly with fever and profuse sweating, then progressed to the formation of gruesome blackish-blue boils in the groin area. These boils, if left untreated, would grow and fester, releasing toxins that led to a gruesome death. Even attempting to lance these buboes could prove fatal, as it sometimes caused the airborne spread of the deadly bacteria. The bubonic plague's mortality rate was staggering, claiming the lives of over 70% of those infected. This horrific disease ravaged Europe, wiping out an estimated 200 million people and slashing the continent's population in half. Historians believe that the Black Death's devastating impact contributed significantly to the downfall of the feudal economic system and inflicted irreparable damage on the power and influence of the church. Many priests perished after tending to the sick and performing last rites, while others, fearing for their own lives, abandoned their parishes. In the face of this invisible enemy, with no scientific understanding of its cause or spread, many resorted to desperate explanations. The Black Death was widely interpreted as a divine punishment, a wrathful response for perceived sins such as greed, blasphemy, and immorality. This belief fueled a wave of religious fanaticism, leading to the persecution of minority groups like Jews, who were scapegoated and massacred in their thousands during the years 1348 and 1349. Even with the development of antibiotics, the bubonic plague continues to haunt the human collective memory as one of the most gruesome and destructive diseases in history. Spanish flu. In 1918, a monstrous flu strain emerged, unleashing a pandemic that would forever be etched in history as one of humanity's deadliest encounters with infectious disease. This ruthless pathogen, estimated to have infected 500 million people worldwide, swept across continents with terrifying speed. Outbreaks erupted in the United States and Europe, rapidly spreading their tendrils across the globe. The virus targeted the respiratory system, leaving victims gasping for breath. Its highly contagious nature meant that a single cough, sneeze, or even spoken word could propel infectious droplets into the air, ready to be inhaled by anyone nearby. Additionally, the virus could linger on surfaces, waiting for an unsuspecting touch to become a gateway into a new host. Despite its indiscriminate nature, this particularly virulent flu strain gained the moniker Spanish influenza due to the heavy burden it placed on Spain. Even the nation's King Alfonso XIII succumbed to its grip. However, the irony lay in the fact that the Spanish flu did not originate in Spain. The name arose simply because Spain, unlike warring nations with strict wartime censorship, had a free press that openly reported on the outbreak from its very beginning in Madrid in late May 1918. Meanwhile, the Allied and Central Powers, on the other hand, aimed to maintain high morale, so they suppressed news of the flu's devastation. This media disparity led many to believe the virus originated in Spain. The Spanish themselves often called it the French flu, because they believed it had arrived from their neighboring country. The Spanish flu had a chilling impact on World War I battlefields, ravaging the ranks of young, healthy soldiers. Records indicate that more Americans perished from the 1918 flu than on the front lines itself. In the United States Navy, 40% of servicemen succumbed to the virus, and the United States Army suffered similarly high infection rates. The flu's effects rippled through the military and civilian sectors alike, with many historians believing it influenced the course of the war by decimating troops and crippling medical infrastructure. With no cure for the flu in sight, medical professionals relied on available treatments to manage symptoms. Aspirin, a relatively new medication trademarked by Bayer in 1899, was widely prescribed. Tragically, the recommended dosages at the time, reaching up to 30 grams per day, were later discovered to be toxic. It wasn't until the 1940s that the development of flu vaccines finally offered a glimmer of hope in the fight against this formidable enemy. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, or TB as it's commonly known, is a persistent and potentially deadly respiratory infection that has plagued humanity for millennia. It exists in two forms: latent tuberculosis and active tuberculosis. Latent tuberculosis lies dormant within the body, often kept in check by a healthy immune system. In fact, 1/3 of the world's population carries this latent form without even realizing it. However, when a person's immune system weakens, latent tuberculosis can transform into its active and far more dangerous counterpart. This active form wreaks havoc on the lungs, triggering persistent coughing fits, agonizing chest pain, drenching night sweats, and loss of appetite. Our long and troubled history with tuberculosis stretches back to the dawn of civilization. Evidence of the tuberculosis bacteria has been unearthed in the bones of ancient Egyptian mummies, suggesting its presence amongst humans for at least 6,000 years. Scientists believe the disease's origins lie in the Neolithic transition, a period around 10,000 years ago when humans transitioned from hunter-gatherer societies to agriculture and animal domestication. It's theorized that the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis originated in these domesticated animals and eventually made the jump to humans. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a terrifying surge of tuberculosis in the rapidly industrializing nations of Europe and North America. This devastating disease, often referred to as consumption, became the leading cause of death across all age groups in the Western world. One particularly insidious route of tuberculosis transmission during this era was through contaminated milk. This led to the development of batch pasteurization, a low-temperature method designed specifically to eradicate tuberculosis bacteria from dairy products. The advent of antibiotics in the mid-20th century marked a turning point in the fight against tuberculosis. Treatment became vastly more effective, rendering the once common practice of isolating patients in sanatoriums for years obsolete. Despite these advancements, tuberculosis remains a significant global health threat, particularly in developing countries with lower hygiene standards and higher population densities. It is a leading cause of death among individuals infected with HIV and claims the lives of an estimated 2 million people annually worldwide. To further complicate matters, new strains of tuberculosis bacteria have emerged that exhibit resistance to conventional antibiotics, making effective treatment increasingly challenging. Polio. Today, polio is a distant memory for most in the developed world, thanks to the revolutionary work of Jonas Salk and his groundbreaking polio vaccine. But before this medical marvel, polio spread with terrifying ease, transmitted through an infected person's stool or airborne droplets from coughs and sneezes. While often asymptomatic, polio's wrath could be devastating. In some cases, the virus attacked the brain and spinal cord, leading to meningitis and, in the most harrowing scenario, paralysis. For 2 to 10 of those paralyzed, the disease tragically claimed their lives. Polio's most notorious legacy lies in its ability to permanently paralyze victims, confining them to iron lungs for the rest of their lives. This paralysis, caused by irreversible nerve damage, could not be reversed. While mobile generators offered some semblance of freedom for a few, others remained prisoners within the iconic iron lungs. The 1950s saw the polio virus strike terror into the hearts of American families. Parents, gripped by fear, attempted social distancing, a desperate and ultimately ineffective measure against the invisible threat. Polio was not part of the life they envisioned for their children. In the seemingly secure post-World War II era, the spread of polio exposed the vulnerability of even middle-class families, shattering the illusion of complete control over their lives. Fear of the highly contagious virus led to drastic measures. Cities shut down public pools, movie theaters, schools, and even churches, forcing religious leaders to reach their congregations through local radio broadcasts. Some motorists, fearing the virus could be carried on the air, refused to fill their flat tires at gas stations in San Angelo, a stark illustration of the paranoia that gripped the nation. Even medical professionals succumbed to the fear, with one physician diagnosing patients based on clinical impression rather than risking infection through the proper diagnostic test. The most iconic figure to suffer the consequences of polio was former U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. His tireless efforts to combat the stigma surrounding the disease permeated every aspect of his presidency, both before and during World War II. Ultimately, Roosevelt's struggle with polio forever altered how society viewed paralytic diseases and the resulting disabilities, paving the way for greater understanding and acceptance. Malaria. Malaria, a mosquito-borne illness caused by parasitic invaders, is considered one of the most horrific diseases in history. Its flu-like symptoms can be debilitating, and in 2016 alone, the disease infected over 200 million individuals, claiming nearly 500,000 lives. This notorious pathogen has even been linked to the possible demise of Alexander the Great, highlighting its historical significance and deadly potential. But the story of malaria goes beyond its lethality. It also holds a dark chapter in the brutal history of the transatlantic slave trade. Before European colonization, there is no evidence of malaria existing in the Americas. Its arrival, therefore, devastated native populations who lacked immunity to this new pathogen. This vulnerability created an opportunity for early European settlers to turn to Africa. Africans, having developed a degree of resistance through childhood exposure to the disease, were seen as a more suitable workforce for the harsh conditions of southern plantations. As malaria ravaged the American South, decimating Native American populations, Africans were increasingly forced into the slave trade to fill the labor void. Fast forward several years, and malaria had become a persistent presence in the southeastern United States. Cases soared during the Great Depression, only to begin a decline in the early 1940s. As the nation geared up for World War II, concerns arose about preventing the spread of malaria within military training camps, particularly those located in the southern states and overseas territories. In 1942, the United States Public Health Service established the Office of Malaria Control in war areas to address this pressing issue. This Atlanta-based office laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, established in 1946 as the Communicable Disease Center. While the office's efforts likely contributed to the eradication of malaria transmission in the United States by the early 1950s, modern scholars debate whether demographic and socioeconomic changes also played a significant role in the disease's decline. Beyond the immediate public health concerns, malaria offered scientists a crucial opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of disease transmission vectors. Studying how mosquitoes and other creatures harbor and spread diseases to human populations became a cornerstone in the development of effective prevention and control strategies. Smallpox. When the first European ships landed on the shores of the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they brought not just advanced weaponry and the will to conquer, but also a silent, invisible enemy: smallpox. This highly contagious and often fatal disease had a long and devastating history in the Old World, where Europeans had coexisted with domesticated animals and shared common water sources for centuries. This close proximity fostered the spread of numerous diseases, but also allowed some individuals to develop a degree of immunity to these pathogens, including smallpox. These immunized Europeans, among the first settlers in the Americas, brought smallpox with them as early as 1520. This disease, along with other Old World illnesses like measles and influenza, unleashed a devastating wave of death upon the indigenous populations. With no prior exposure to these pathogens, Native Americans lacked the natural defenses to combat them. The result was catastrophic, with smallpox alone estimated to have killed nearly 90 of the Native American population. This was a far greater toll than the direct casualties inflicted by European warfare. Smallpox wasn't just deadly, it was also a cruel disfigurer. The virus ravaged the body, leaving its victims covered in oozing sores. In a desperate attempt to combat the disease, those who had survived smallpox, now immune themselves, were often called upon to care for the sick. These caregivers employed a range of treatments, including herbal remedies, bloodletting, and even the bizarre practice of exposing patients to red objects. A far more effective approach emerged in the form of inoculation, also known as variolation. This practice involved taking puce or powdered scabs from individuals with a mild case of smallpox and inserting them into the skin or nose of healthy people. The process induced a controlled infection that usually resulted in a milder illness, granting the recipient immunity to future outbreaks. Although some individuals died from the practice, the mortality rate was significantly lower than that of naturally contracted smallpox. Through centuries of continued efforts, including widespread vaccination campaigns, smallpox was finally declared eradicated in 1980, becoming the only human disease to be completely wiped out. Today, the only remaining traces of this once dreaded killer exist in the heavily guarded confines of research laboratories. Now it's time for today's subscriber's pick. So far, we have looked into some of the most horrific diseases in history, from the agonizing effects of smallpox to the relentless spread of Ebola. But some illnesses went beyond physical suffering, leaving a mark of horror etched onto the human body itself. Take a look at this image. The man stares back with a face ravaged by disease. His nose is sunken, his skin marred by lesions, and his eyes hold a deep sadness. This could be the consequence of a disease like syphilis, a bacterial infection that, if left untreated, could ravage the body in its later stages. Imagine the excruciating pain, the social isolation, and the constant reminder of the disease etched upon the flesh. What do you think it would have been like to live with such a condition in a time before effective treatments? How did these diseases not only steal lives, but also redefine the way people were perceived by society? Cholera, a potentially deadly infectious disease, is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. This bacteria thrives in warm, slightly salty waters like estuaries and coastal areas. People become infected by ingesting contaminated food or water, often through raw or undercooked shellfish. The culprit behind cholera's devastating effects is a toxin produced by the bacteria. This toxin wreaks havoc on the intestines, causing them to release excessive amounts of water, leading to severe diarrhea and rapid dehydration due to electrolyte and fluid loss. A single episode of diarrhea can cause 1,000,000-fold increase in the bacteria's presence in the environment. One of the earliest documented cholera outbreaks comes from the writings of Gaspar Correa, a Portuguese historian. In his book, Legendary India, he vividly described a devastating disease that swept through the Ganges Delta in the spring of 1543. This disease, referred to as Morixi by the locals, claimed lives within 8 hours of symptom onset and boasted such a high fatality rate that communities struggled to bury the dead. Over the following centuries, numerous reports of cholera outbreaks emerged along the west coast of India, documented by Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British observers. The first full-blown cholera pandemic occurred in 1817, and it was caused by contaminated rice in Jessore, India. Fueled by established European trade routes, the disease quickly spread throughout most of India, modern-day Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. By 1820, cholera's relentless march had reached the Philippines and Thailand, Indonesia, where it claimed over 100,000 lives on the island of Java alone. From Southeast Asia, infected individuals on ships carried the disease further, introducing it to China in 1820 and Japan 2 years later. Cholera's reach extended beyond Asia. In 1821, British troops stationed in India transported the disease to Oman, from where it eventually found its way into the Persian Gulf region. Europe wasn't spared either, with outbreaks reaching modern-day Turkey, Syria, and southern Russia. This first pandemic finally subsided after 6 years, likely due to the harsh winter of 1823 to 1824, which may have significantly reduced the bacteria's survival rate in water sources. However, cholera's grip on humanity wasn't over. Subsequent pandemics emerged in Africa and the Americas. Even today, this disease continues to cast a shadow, with an estimated 4 million cases and over 100,000 deaths reported annually. Leprosy. Leprosy often conjures images of a disease confined to the dusty pages of history books. This is true because the earliest evidence of the disease is found in a 4,000-year-old skeleton unearthed in India. In addition to this, references to leprosy appear in the Bible and other major religious texts, solidifying its place as a disease that has touched humanity for millennia. However, leprosy is not solely a relic of the past. It remains a very real concern, with approximately 200,000 new cases diagnosed annually. Much of our modern understanding of leprosy stems from its prevalence in medieval Europe. While the disease likely originated in the Indian subcontinent, by the 13th century, Europe was grappling with a staggering number of cases, with estimates suggesting the existence of 19,000 leprosy hospitals across the continent. It's believed that trade routes and the movement of armies played a significant role in the disease's spread westward. One of the most well-known figures associated with leprosy during this period was Baldwin, the fourth king of Jerusalem in the 12th century. Left untreated, leprosy can cause significant damage to the body. Before effective treatments were discovered, the disease could lead to severe disfigurement. Infection can wreak havoc on the nerves, respiratory tract, skin, and eyes. Nerve damage can lead to a loss of sensation, particularly pain, which can result in the loss of extremities due to repeated injuries or infections that go unnoticed. Muscle weakness and vision problems are also potential consequences of the disease. Much of the fear and stigma surrounding leprosy is a legacy of the time when the disease was untreatable and its transmission poorly understood. People diagnosed with leprosy were often isolated in sanatoriums, the remnants of which can still be found in various parts of the world today. However, the understanding of leprosy has undergone a dramatic transformation since the late 19th century. In 1873, a Norwegian physician named Gerhard Armauer Hansen made a groundbreaking discovery. He identified Mycobacterium leprae, the bacteria responsible for leprosy. This revelation paved the way for a deeper understanding of how the disease spreads and the development of effective medications capable of curing it. Today, a cure for leprosy is readily available, and we now know that the disease is not highly contagious. While treatment is effective and accessible, many individuals are diagnosed too late to prevent the onset of leprosy-related disabilities. This unfortunate reality makes leprosy one of the world's leading causes of preventable disability. Typhus, a group of bacterial diseases encompassed under the same name, carries a history as chilling as its clinical description. Its very name, derived from the Greek word typhus, meaning smoky or hazy, hints at the altered mental state experienced by those afflicted. The first documented account of typhus emerged during the Spanish siege of Granada in 1489. Survivors described victims suffering from high fevers, red rashes spreading across their bodies, and a descent into delirium. Gangrenous sores and the putrid stench of decaying flesh were all grim hallmarks of the disease's brutal progression. During this siege alone, while only 3,000 Spanish soldiers fell to enemy forces, 17,000 succumbed to typhus. Throughout Europe, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, typhus epidemics ravaged populations with terrifying regularity. Its presence loomed large during the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War, and the Napoleonic Wars. In the 30 Years' War, an estimated 8 million Germans perished not from battle wounds, but from the combined onslaught of bubonic plague and typhus. During Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow in 1812, more French soldiers met their demise from typhus than at the hands of the Russian army. A crucial misconception persisted among American physicians of the 19th century. They believed typhus and typhoid were variations of the same illness, differing only in the severity of symptoms. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. While both diseases share a similarity in their names, their origins and modes of transmission are vastly different. Typhus is a bacterial infection transmitted through the bites of infected body lice, while typhoid is a food-borne bacterial infection primarily affecting the intestines. The confusion likely stemmed from the overlapping symptoms these diseases presented. Despite its horrific legacy and millions of lives claimed throughout history, typhus is now considered a rare disease. It primarily occurs in populations suffering from extreme overcrowding and poor hygiene, conditions that allow the louse-borne bacteria to spread with ease. HIV/AIDS. Few diseases have been as heavily shrouded in fear and stigma as HIV, the virus that leads to AIDS. Scientists believe it made the jump from primates to humans in Africa sometime during the early 20th century, and silently spread for decades before its devastating consequences became apparent. While HIV arrived in the United States around 1970, it remained largely hidden from public awareness until the early 1980s. In 1981, the The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published a report that sent shockwaves through the medical community. It detailed 5 previously healthy homosexual men who had contracted pneumocystis pneumonia, a rare and opportunistic infection caused by the normally harmless fungus Pneumocystis jirovecii. This type of pneumonia, the CDC noted with alarm, almost never occurred in individuals with healthy immune systems. The following year, the New York Times published a groundbreaking article about this new and terrifying immune system disorder, which had already affected 335 people and had claimed the lives of 136. Because the disease appeared to primarily affect homosexual men, officials initially labeled it gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. Despite the CDC discovering all major routes of HIV transmission by 1983, the public perception remained firmly rooted in the misconception that AIDS was solely a gay disease. It even earned the cruel moniker, the Gay Plague, for many years after. Finally, in September 1982, the CDC officially adopted the term AIDS to describe the disease. By the end of that year, cases were also being reported in numerous European countries. The HIV/AIDS pandemic has since become a global tragedy. Over 70 million people have been infected with HIV, and an estimated 35 million have succumbed to AIDS since the pandemic began. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.